Welcome, everyone. We appreciate being gathered with you and your interest and time from really across the nation today to be with us. I'm Dave Clayton. I'm a Senior Vice President with Strata Education Network. I lead our Center for Consumer Education, Consumer Insights, where we've spent significant time and effort surveying individuals about their interest and their experience with education and work after high school. And I'm delighted to be able to be here today with our guests and the panel that's been prepared, and particularly for those of you who are choosing to learn more and to contribute in the areas of education and workforce. And we think particularly about this time in our nation and what we're confronting and the needs individuals have to find paths forward in their individual circumstances and in our communities. Let me begin just by welcoming and asking each of our panelists to introduce themselves. Why don't we start with Austin? He's the CEO of College Forward, and his preview highlight is he was in a blues band with his father during high school and trained to play the drums, the sax, the guitar, and the piano in case anybody didn't ever show up. But with that, Austin, go ahead.
I just told you that, Dave. Thanks. It's really wonderful to be here. Thank you so much to everyone who's put this on today. I'll be brief. I know we'll be going a little bit more into detail about each of our respective organizations here in a bit, and some of our vision and what we're doing to solve some of these big problems. But as Dave said, my name is Austin Buckin. I am the CEO at College Forward. I've been with the organization about 11 years and have spent my entire career, which is really just 2 more years beyond that, working in college success, typically with first generation underserved students to help them get to and through college. And that is exactly what we do today at College Forward. We really specialize in providing wraparound 360 support to students, really beginning the tail end of high school and then all the way through degree completion, whether that's a 1-year high demand, high market value certificate, all the way to a master's degree or beyond. It's a long service model. That means our mission is very long and the work we do is a long time horizon. It also means, though, that we see a significant part of the student life cycle, and one that unfortunately many organizations don't really see. There's tons of organizations that help students get to college, not as many sticking all the way through to see year-to-year persistence and graduation. So that's the perspective I'm hoping to bring to this conversation. A couple of data points. When I came to the organization, we were serving just over 300 students. We have now scaled over the past 10 years to support over 16,000 students directly around the state of Texas and nationally. In addition to that, as a fun side note that'll show up in the conversation, because we are, I guess, too bored solving one problem, we had to create some other solutions. So we actually have a software as a service social enterprise that we built out in-house at College Forward. It's an initiative called Copilot we built in partnership with Salesforce.com. That infrastructure and that data set and technology set is now reaching another 500,000 students in 22 states around the country. So talk more about that. But that is my brief intro, and thank you, Dave. If you want to talk about blues scales and music, we can follow about that in the Q&A.
Yeah, thank you. My son was wrapping up piano practice as we were waiting for the session to begin. Laura Evans with the Ewing and Marion Kauffman Foundation also is joining us, and really a variety of perspectives from your career that you'll bring today. But Laura, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, thank you, Dave. And it's nice to see all the faces online, and it's honored to be a part of this conversation. I am a relative newcomer to Kauffman. I have been there for about 19 months. Came specifically to be a part of the work that I'll talk more about later around real world learning. It's really a regional collaborative effort to ensure our high school students particularly are leaving equipped, ready for learning and work that lies ahead. I don't feel very qualified to be in philanthropy very often, but I do feel qualified to talk about what equips students to be ready for the workforce, because prior to this, I spent 25 years working in a company called Cerner Corporation. It's kind of a homegrown, but now multinational organization. And in that time frame, the way I characterize my career is we grew from 800 employees to 29,000 when I left. So being a part of a wild ride like that gives you lots of opportunities to understand what it takes to unlock potential talent. And that happens inside the organization. And it certainly was something we thought a lot about, what was happening outside, and particularly what was in our backyard, and how do we effectively engage and cultivate the connections that are necessary to ensure that those students have the opportunities that, or at least are aware of the opportunities that we had to offer. So learned a lot through that, have participated in developing a couple of programs in our region that we can also talk a little bit about, but that really became the basis for my belief and passion around the scale and to really drive transformative change into our, at least high school, and really probably our systems of education in general. So again, I'm pleased to be here. Thanks for including me.
Thank you, Laura. And Jonathan, good things come to those who wait. We're sorry for the technical difficulties getting started, but really you maybe at an earlier stage, but certainly an innovator in the New Orleans region. And if you just share a little bit of an overview or a snapshot introduction for yourself and how you've come to this work, and then we'll dive in as a panel.
Yeah, absolutely. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to join. Quickly, I'm the founder and CEO of Rooted School, a nonprofit based in New Orleans. I got into the work largely because of a dream I had when I was in 3rd grade. I came home one day, my mother was crying, and she was crying because we were going to lose our childhood home because our neighborhood was gentrifying and we couldn't afford the rise in fees. And one, I was incredibly angry that my parents let this happen, or so I thought at the time. But that anger ended up turning into a seed. And the seed was me desiring to do something with my life so that other young people didn't have to grow up and end up losing their childhood home like I did. That sprouted to an opportunity I got when I was a senior in college to, once I became the first person in my family to graduate college, think about how I wanted to make a contribution in the world. And I chose to teach right out of college. And I had the opportunity to teach in Central City, New Orleans, as an 8th grade social studies teacher at a KIPP school. And it's there that I met a young man who ends up changing my life forever and is a huge inspiration for how I started Rooted School. He was a young man who, while worked really hard to close his own learning gaps and put himself on track for a full college tuition, started selling drugs in his 8th grade year to make ends meet for his family. And when he was murdered during one of those drug deals, that experience caused me to question what more could we be doing to ensure that all members of our society have a chance to climb the economic ladder. And that questioning led to the opportunity of Rooted School after my 4th year of teaching. And so Rooted School is a nonprofit that exists to provide students personal pathways to financial freedom. One way that Rooted does this is by partnering with communities across the US to open public charter high schools that provide a talent solution to innovative companies who are growing, starting within regional technology sectors. We do this by giving our students a chance to earn at least 4 industry-based credentials in the tech sector by the time that they graduate. We have our first graduating class coming up this year and have started to get job offers in. One example of a role is one of our students has been given an offer of a fabrication lab technician at an additive manufacturing company here in New Orleans. He got that opportunity by earning his Autodesk Inventor credential during his freshman year, which is like a CAD software, and interning with the company for the past 3 years. In conclusion, we anticipate approximately half of our first cohort of seniors, which is about 20 students, will get offers like these and make roughly $40,000 a year before taxes right out of high school. And if we're successful over time, I believe we'll help companies and the regions that they call home grow. will also give more youth a chance to accelerate their own upward mobility. So that's a bit of the perspective that I'll be bringing to the conversation. And again, thank you for having me.
Jonathan, thank you, and Laura and Austin as well. And for those of you participating with us today, we will have the last third of our time together for your questions and answers. We'll have some questions that I'll moderate, but please share and submit those questions so that we can speak to those and take notes as we go along and help with that. You know, in our public opinion research, we've all known of a crisis around the value, the cost and the price of post-secondary education, particularly, you know, undergraduate education. But there's a different crisis happening right now that we're seeing in our public opinion research. Compared to a year ago, adults without college degrees who are actively thinking or planning on enrolling, they're half as likely to believe that it will be worth the cost. Only 17–18% of them strongly believe that education would be worth the cost, and that's dropped in half from where it was a year ago. And similarly, it's dropped in half from what was 54% of them strongly agreed that it would help them get a good job, to now 24% believing it will help me get a good job. So that crisis confidence in the marketplace, and similarly amongst adults who have lost income and work and shift hours and opportunities, they have similarly low levels of confidence that it'll be worth the cost and will help them get a job. And so traditionally, we've always seen that run to education during economic disruption. And yet the latest numbers are that community college enrollment is down 7.5%. So people have this paradox of increased interest, but decreased confidence to act. And so we're not seeing the enrollment amongst our adult workforce. And then we think about, you know, last year, I remember some National Opinion Research Center numbers that talked about the low percentages of high school students, even then, who felt it was important to have a college degree or education after high school to be successful in a career. And so this confidence in the output, at the same time, we're seeing increased impatience, maybe with a long-term four-year degree, and increased interest in the non-degree pathways, short-term credentials. And what we've seen in that broader research is actually individuals who've had a success experience are more likely to say they want additional education in the future compared to someone who starts college and stops out. So those individuals who've successfully completed certificates and certifications and non-degree programs and gotten a benefit from it are more likely to say education is relevant and a path to that upward mobility that we all seek. So we have this tension between, you know, is this another way to track of college bound and non-college, or is this something that becomes a pathway to lifelong learning and progression and development that is the true upward mobility, and starting, you know, well into the, you know, we think about early childhood and K through 12 and into post-secondary. So it'll be interesting for us to visit together today and get your experiences. You know, I'd just like to start and think about, Jonathan, when you think about, you mentioned it a little bit, but the leverage that you need to make that connection, you can't just do it alone in your school. So what has been the community impact of pulling other stakeholders into that ecosystem and that vision and that dream that you have for the opportunity for your students, so that you have 3 years worth of internship while you're in high school? And just if you have insights on the ingredients where the education effort can become have some gravity to pull others in through your leadership, I think that would be helpful.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Dave. I think the big headline for us in our approach is that your network is your net worth. And so for students, our goal is to leverage the role and the relationships we have in the community to build their own social capital. And let me just give you a quick story that paints the example of why that matters. Is take a CEO who is running their company and monthly has dinner with a friend who's a CEO at another company. And say that CEO says, hey man, let me, I got my kid, they're graduating. You might could you hire them and take them on right out of high school? I think we all would know, shake our heads yes, that CEO is going to take that friend's child, because if anything goes wrong, he can go straight to his friend and say, hey, get this together, right? And so if I was to go to that same person, not having dinner with that person once a month and make the same request, 9 times out of 10, that's getting turned down. And that's largely because we haven't had the longer on-ramp of cultivating a relationship of trust. And so the goal really for us, and we are sort of betting everything on this, is that the longer on-ramp we create for an organization, a company, to cultivate a relationship with a young person and vice versa, is that it will sort of increase the likelihood that there will be a solid enough foundation of trust where that employer is comfortable saying 3-4 years after engaging with a student in the school that student is at, that they're comfortable making that bet. And this is actually something that one of our employer partners at Scale Workspace in New Orleans said when interviewed about this. They said, after 2 years of working with this student, I have the perfect hire. They're more coachable, they're more affordable, and they're willing to grow much quickly than any other entry-level talent that I had ever hired.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's great. And I think Laura and Austin, you've both seen things go from 300 to 16 and 800 to 29,000. So if you think about Jonathan's position on that scale ramp and how you move those build those relationships out. Austin, do you want to just share with us in your work this key to sort of access is one thing, enrollment is another, and how you kind of bridge that divide most effectively in helping students make choices that fit their needs and their pathways, because it's not a one-size-fit-all experience. And just what you think are the keys to success in that transition from secondary to post-secondary from your perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a wildly complex question because it's so wildly individual. We think about, sometimes I feel like when we talk about students, I mean, I do this work and I see our students as much as humanly possible, and still sometimes think or forget that, and many times these are 17-year-olds who are talking about taking on tens of thousands of dollars of debt, making a huge bet on their future. In many ways, they are the most extreme entrepreneurs that any of us knows. With limited information and infinite amount of barriers and obstacles in front of them, and yet it somehow miraculously it sometimes works for them, right? But it is a huge gamble and risk, Dave, to your question around and this issue of this contradictory experience that we're seeing in the attraction level of university or a 2-year degree or lower, and the realities of the economy of now that we're all experiencing, I think, in real time. The reality, though, to your question on these transition points, is that we have created, I would argue, one of the most complex higher ed systems for low-income students in this country that we could probably design if we tried to do exactly that. The number of issues that we are unfortunately having to manage on the front end are so logistical in nature, and they're so absolutely critical that once again, if a 16, 17 year old doesn't get their parents' correct tax information on the right time, it doesn't send the right 3 documents of follow-up mailed paperwork to the IRS, they may not go to college, right? And those barriers are barriers that are exclusively limited to the low-income student experience in this country. And that's where we see this, I think, critical question of equity coming up. I think much of what we talk about today, these issues that we talk about, the challenges that our students experience, the barriers they're having to navigate, are literally exclusive to the low-income experience in this country, right? Middle income, high middle income, upper class students on the west side of Austin, Texas, where we are not having to struggle with these same types of questions, right? So for us, because of that reality, unfortunately, half, if not more than half of what we do as an organization for our students is help mitigate as many of these logistical challenges as possible and make as simple as possible, demystify the process as much as possible. And that is a huge piece of that. Now, all of these logistics, that we have to help navigate have to be undergirded by, in our opinion, a strong relationship. and Jonathan alluded to this, it is the absolute, Pandora's box of a question that we could go down of how do you scale relationships, because the perils of getting the relationship wrong with the student will result in some tuning out or lack of engagement on a very complicated process. Or worst case scenario, we may have the wrong information, the wrong relationship to give the wrong advice to a student who could then very well go on to accrue $60,000, $70,000 in debt and no college degree. So it is very much a tightrope walk, high wire act that our students and our staff are walking through that can only be, I think, mitigated by strong relationships that have to be data informed and grounded in the realities of each individual student. The four big buckets: the academic readiness, the logistical preparedness, the financial aid transitions and preparedness. And then the big piece that we don't talk nearly enough about for low-income students, first-gen students, is that social cultural adjustment. Walking onto a predominantly white institution as maybe a Latinx student who only has grown up on the east side of Texas or in Austin, Texas. Those social transitions, the feelings of imposter syndrome that can crop up, especially in that first year, are real, and where we spend most of our time behind the scenes, I think, mitigating some of the bigger issues that we run into.
Yeah, thank you, Austin. And I think, Laura, I was fortunate enough to do some work with the Irvine Foundation a number of years ago as they were developing and launching linked learning. And I think so much of the parallels there of it's not an either or, you can have college ready and career ready in this work, but that sense of confidence and exposure to possibilities that you're actually building in with the real world pieces. I don't know if you want to speak to how you blend that sort of real world, I'm prepared to go forward, but also have that be an and opportunity, not a detour, but you have the work readiness and the preparedness to succeed and make that cultural shift into post-secondary education as well. Your thoughts?
Yeah, we definitely don't see, we think it's far too binary today. And to Jonathan's great points and others that Austin echoed, we're talking about humans. And each one will carve a path, but we have to make it easier for them to understand what even lies out in that future. And so we very much believe in our work that we're doing in Kansas City that real world learning is a missing and integral component of how we should be doing school. High school for certain. We've committed to a regional goal here in the region, which 6 counties is our footprint, 100,000 high school students, that every one of them by 2030 will leave high school with one or more of what we've called market valued assets. And those include things like substantive work experience, robust entrepreneurial experiences, 9 or more hours of post-secondary college credit so that they've figured some of that out and they're well on their way, or an industry recognized credential. But we've also somewhat asterisked those credentials by saying we are going to, as a region, working with our employer community, identify those that we feel are most relevant and valued, because too often, and especially this is an increasing dynamic, those IRCs are focused on the technical skills that change very rapidly. And as we know, our current education systems are not built for that speed or agility. So I think what I was thinking about as we were talking about things, I do believe trust drives connections and connections create access. I also believe that fundamentally students need to know their why, no different than adults. And I think I learned this early on in my work in my prior job when I was responsible for learning and development, and realizing that time is money, and to really accomplish the outcomes we wanted with some of the things we were doing, we needed to first make sure the adults we were working with had a clear sense of what's relevant about this for the work that I'm doing. Students need that same connection, and it starts early. They can't, to use some probably overused phrases, they can't be what they can't see. What they can see in a traditional academic environment is often so limited. And so we've spent time as a region identifying common language and a set of experiences that we believe are critical, or a good place to start. Let me say that. for our students to start to see things so that they can explore, engage, and eventually immerse in work, exactly as you're probably describing, Jonathan. And by the time they are getting to that next step in their decision-making process, which is about how will I continue learning, it's not about, do I stop and go get the job and work for 40 years? That will not be an option. So it's, how do I continue learning, where, and what have I learned about myself, my interests, my abilities through these real world learning opportunities that helps me make an informed decision. Scaling all of this is by far our biggest challenge. Data has to inform it, but it's relational too. So it's one of those both and situations that those are very familiar to me coming out of my industry background. I think they need to become more comfortable for those of us working in other spaces because they are our reality. Hope that addressed your question.
It's very helpful, and I know the audience is already, some of you are starting to share questions, and we'll turn to those in about 10 minutes or so. Just wanted to ask each of you, if you think about what each of you would say is your #1 metric for success. If you could say, this is the needle we are trying to move, and we can measure it and we can track it and report on it. And maybe Austin, we'll start with you, and then Jonathan and Laura.
It's such a wildly hard question, Dave, but it's also very simple for us. We've had so many sleepless night conversations about this. But I mean, for College Forward, we've really settled on a college degree as defined by the student in terms of what their end goal was, not a bachelor's degree as dictated by College Forward, but an on-time graduation, post-secondary credential in line with their degree and their career pathway. Again, ideally on time. That's what we're really driving, is quick completion so that they can get into the workforce. We have talked about, do we extend beyond and go to advanced degrees and workforce? Is that the true metric? Of course it is. But then we're going to get into marriage counseling, and we think 401k planning for our students. So we had to pick. But that's certainly the outcome that's keeping us up at night, and where we're trying to focus as many of our efforts as possible. Because y'all, that is still an incredibly leaky pipeline. Even looking at those students in Central Texas alone who do start college, only about 26% of them are ever completing. So even if you move that denominator up to that freshman year of college, we still have a huge equity gap for our low-income student population. So that's the metric we're trying to move, and using that for on-time graduation as our metric is our key benchmark.
That's great. Jonathan?
Yeah, thanks, Dave. For us, we are looking at a return on investment calculator that we're using as a key metric. And so if we have approximately 70% of our employer partners reporting a net positive ROI of our students coming out of high school and the contributions that they're making year one out the gate, if that's a net positive ROI, we think that will create a positive ripple effect of impact. And it will not only be a tool that grows the companies, but allows them to grow the community as well and be a win-win for all.
It's great. We often think of ROI in terms of the student individual outcome, but to focus on solving employer needs, a real different perspective than most people take, and a powerful one. Laura, any summary you would have?
Well, unquestionably our market value assets, which we call MVAs, are probably our key metric, but I would caveat that by saying we underpin this work with a long-term data strategy that's regional in nature, that will enable us to study outcomes for those students who earn those MVAs, as well as hopefully other digital evidence that we might have about other things that they did will help us refine and hone what we think those disproportionately impactful experiences really need to be, and also will allow us to adapt as the world changes and those market value assets change too.
Yeah, well, thank you. I want to ask you each, from your perspective, if you think of, Austin and Jonathan, we have funders and philanthropists and donors who are participating and listening. And then Laura will change the question a little for you, but what do you think are the most important or constructive question a funder or philanthropist looking at this issue of true upward mobility? What should they be focused on? If you're telling them to evaluate who they're looking to fund and how to evaluate a good program or a good opportunity, what do you think is at the core of a good decision for them? Jonathan, do you want to start?
Sure. I was hoping that Austin and I would get a chance to rock, paper, scissors that one, but next. Something that I've become really obsessive about is taking what we have come to learn about effective brands, or what it takes to build an effective brand over the past couple of decades. I believe that an area that we have struggled in this work, and I don't think my friends at Europe would find this a problem that I'm sharing this, but something that I've heard folks at Europe talk about around this is, they have trouble scaling the ability of getting students jobs. And one of the reasons for that is how employers are looking at or sort of branding the young people that they work with. And the brand, in short, is largely, I'm doing you a favor. This is charity. And what I believe where I believe there will be a shift is if we reframe that relationship, and the brand of the student becomes, no, actually, the student is contributing value to your organization and is contributing a myriad of variables that, whether it's their age, being Generation Z, whether it's, things related to their identity and makeup, like these are value adds. And so I think the better we can go about rewriting that narrative and branding that for employers so that they can see the value of young people, we'll start making some significant strides in the scale front.
Thank you, Jonathan. So again, you're bringing us back to the importance of, throughout, a theme for you has been engaging employers, connecting individuals to employers, but changing employer perceptions, that they see the net benefit ROI to their enterprise, and they see this talent and the resources that the individuals come to them. And particularly when you get into equity issues and some prejudices and biases that can exist in the system. We'll come back to that, but I was gratified today. We saw a Starbucks announcement that their commitment to corporate employees, right? It's 2.5%, and they're committed to changing that up in their corporate, not just their kind of retail locations. And another was speaking with another major kind of Fortune 10, Fortune 100 employer about a month ago. And they said, if we relied on, because of the disequities in our traditional post-secondary education system, if we relied solely on those pathways for the leaders that we need for our company in the future, we'll never have the diversity of talent, experience, and abilities that we need. And so they're looking at other pathways to cultivate and develop talent and seeing it as an asset that you're speaking to. So finding those employers and that, connecting that space really is a resonant theme. Austin, your advice to a funding community of the smartest question they could focus on in making a good choice.
Boy, this is so complex, and I feel like I've said that 5 times already, but it's true. The thing that I'm thinking about is really I've never been on the other side of the table of the philanthropy roundtable. I've been squarely on this side of it. And that said, I've thought of our foundations who have been some of the largest in the country to some in our own backyard, smaller family foundations. The ones that we've had the best relationships with, of where I've seen them have successes outside of just College Forward and their investment in us. It's really figuring out their own vision for scale and how they want to leverage and how they define success for specific investments. For the nonprofit sector, this is maybe a little disparaging, right? College Forward is one of the largest college success providers in the country, reaching 16,000 students. And there are 5.7 more million more students in Texas alone that we are not reaching. And the reality is, I think that when you're thinking about these investments, the S word of scale keeps coming up, but it really is the absolute critical question. Not because necessarily College Forward or other nonprofits like ours or Jonathan's are the ones who are singularly going to solve this, but we do have a scaled mindset. And if you have an entrepreneurial nonprofit leader, systems leader, someone who maybe has more agency over policy control at the local, state, or federal level, where we can move our way closer and closer to real policy reform, that's where the real impact happens. But I am a true believer that many of the best ideas that are rooted and designed with scale and with relationships at the center can be found in the nonprofit space. We're more entrepreneurial, we're more flexible, and we sometimes, I think, more often than other industries, we know our limits. I think it's incumbent upon us to work ourselves out of a job, right? That's a unique piece, I think, about the nonprofit sector, and in admitting that we will never reach full scale as a nonprofit, as a singular organization. How we start leveraging the corporate space to do that, how we start leveraging the policy space to do that. And as we've started to touch as our own organization, moving more into systems change and systems reform, taking these ideas we know work in our own environments and embedding them into systems that are already at scale, finding those promises of those really interesting potential investments as a philanthropist, as a funder, I think has to be front and center. And that outcome that matters most to you, I think also has to be there. I think too much we have focused just on college enrollment rates, and we've seen the spillover effect. So I think really holding our feet to the fire, holding systems feet to the fire, that enrollment is not enough. We have to get those credentials, and credentials aren't enough either. We have to get them into a meaningful job, and holding us to account against some of these critical outcomes. Those are the sorts of questions I would be asking, and the types of questions I would be filtering some good opportunities.
Yeah, thank you. That three-legged stool of aligning the nonprofit innovation and relationship-focused community presence with the policy environment, and then really the private sector corporate pieces. And Laura, I actually would be curious your thoughts of how your endeavors there are working to pull in those private sector partners. You've been on the private sector side, but how are you a catalyst and kind of leveraging resources in the private sector to bring them to bear and align with your vision of the possibilities and the work to be done?
Yeah, certainly. Well, I think the easiest thing for a private sector partner to do is write a check, but that's actually not what we're asking for. We're asking for their time and meaningful engagement and willingness to invest in future workforce that they may get to benefit from, but they might not. And I agree strongly that there has to be enough ROI in that interaction that makes it worth their while, but they have to do that knowing that students can opt out as easily as they opt in. We've spent a fair amount of time in our region building a coalition of support in our employer community and really thinking about that, not just in terms of large employers, but also the entrepreneurial ecosystem and the community there, and how do we tap into their needs because they're very different. We've spent time working on, again, it sounds simple, but common language and really infrastructure that helps bridge two very different sectors, especially the private sector, and then in the education, but also the philanthropic, not-for-profit sector. We don't use the same language sometimes, we speak past each other. And so we focused on a set of common outcomes and then backed into what are the signals that tell us we're making progress or not together. And we have to hold ourselves, I mean, there's shared accountability in that. I see no desire to slow down. And that is saying something, given that we're in a very different period now than when we started this work. Actually, the employers who I was working closely with prior to joining the foundation, we were kind of saying the same thing in terms of there's no silver bullet here for how do we help develop the talent in our backyards, but real world learning is as close as we can see. So how do we influence these other systems? And And so I think there was a willingness, there was kind of parallel learning journeys that were happening that then converged. And I would say there has to be a lot of recognition that you're going to learn together. This is a pretty, this is an entrepreneurial endeavor in some ways. And it's really hard to do that and think about scale at the same time, but you can't afford to not give those. I mean, those are super important questions.
Yeah, thank you. And traditionally, employers have been fairly hands-off in our nation's talent development pipeline. Give me somebody who's ready to work, and if they've got it, I'll put them to work. And so pulling them into that partnership, because just as Jonathan articulated those early mentorship and internship, everything in our research shows that, particularly for individuals who are first in their families to pursue post-secondary education or face other barriers in our society. Laura, you said you can't be what you can't see, but that connection to employers is the most valuable, but the least available to those individuals about what to study and what courses to pursue. And then you look at the internship and the chances to apply what you're learning through work, and those types of things are the real value adds. As we look at the number one predictor in our data set, if somebody's saying my education was high quality, it was worth the cost, is the degree to which they say it was relevant to their work. So the relevance of that education experience and connection to work just in many ways pulls through. Let's turn to some questions from our audience, and this is to each of you, from Jennifer LaForest. With the advancements made in technology that have transformed the job market over the last 20 years, would you say that all high school curriculum should offer the type of credentialing and work experience that you're doing through your models in order to better equip graduates, not only for the workplace, but to offset and prepare them for increasing costs of higher education? So really thinking about these digital literacy and the technology impact and the AI and all those pressures that we're having, and kind of the role of that in bridging and preparation. Jonathan, do you want to do rock, paper, scissors, or just tell us who should go first?
No, I can go very quickly, Dave. This is very easy for me. Yes. And especially for young people who are on the lower rungs of the economic ladder in our country, I believe they need as many resources, tools, credentials at their disposal to increase the likelihood of their lifelong success and financial security.
And we have a similar curriculum, Dave, on our end. It's not tech oriented, but just the entire universe of navigating college, getting ready, getting everything prepared mentally, emotionally, financially. Similarly ought to be taught, I think, in class. We are an after-school program, as many organizations are, out of necessity, but we have had a couple of school districts who have piloted with us, building on an 8th period in the 8th period block, where we have students captivated in a classroom every other day, in partnership with other nonprofits, leveraging that time to build the curriculum into the school day. And that has been working. But I'll say as well, like from my perspective, let's start with this other crisis, which is that the high school counselor to student ratio in Texas is about 500 to 1. Every high school counselor in our state has about 500 students they're responsible for, figuring out all these nuances we've been talking about today. Let's get that down to something more manageable. The federal guideline recommendation is 250, so half that. You combine those two pieces of investments in these personal relationships with better curriculum that Jonathan and other groups have built out into the school day, we're talking about real scale and change.
I would just, my only challenge to that, and I think this is the challenge that we really have to think hard about, is if those counselors are not well connected to the vast, array of options, which it's difficult to stay connected to, I think we'll make incremental progress. But that's where we have really bet on integrating real world learning experiences, because we know a byproduct of those experiences is that students automatically get a few more people, if you will, in their village who know a few more people. And those become resources that they can connect to get that advisement. And, we've also, I would say kind of a love-hate relationship with pathways. I think relevance is super important. I think 14, 15, 16-year-olds are still trying to figure a lot of stuff out and need a lot of time and space to explore. And I think I'm speaking as a parent probably, as well as someone who's worked with a fair number of students. And I do think we need to keep this both and this dynamic of there are some essential, we've called them essential skills now: communication, collaboration, interpersonal skills, self-management and self-regulation, something we call adulting or executive function. We've debated what to call it. These are threads that kids need to be taught, skills that they need to be taught and exposed to. But then on top of that, I completely agree, and especially for those students who, who a sustaining wage is so important to their family as well as their future learning path. Those certifications can be a great way to get into that earn learn model. We use that successfully at a pretty sophisticated, healthcare technology organization. And the side benefit that brought to us was it really dramatically increased the diversity of the student population that we were connecting to. And it was simply just connecting at a different time. And then they still had, well, I should say they were able to see all the reasons why you would want to continue building on stacking those credentials, continuing that learning, because you're now immersed in the environment and you can see that that's what's required.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. Even as we work with colleges and universities, there's some sense amongst leaders that faculty at that level may not know the types of careers that their students will go on to, and that awareness. So if you think of bringing that career space into the ecosystem in a high school, and just by being in the water, your faculty, your counselors, the people in the schools start to be attuned to MVAs, right? I mean, they start to recognize and think in those terms beyond the traditional academic content. So powerful thoughts there. There's a question from Jennifer Mazrai, and she talks about the many students with disabilities and their challenges, and particularly that those are children of color. Also, if we look at those for whom English is a second language. And if you have thoughts as a group, any of you, on particular areas of emphasis that are keys to success with those individuals who face additional challenges in their lives. Any thoughts for Jennifer?
I will just hop in and say that I was actually on a call this morning where we had a couple of our districts describing those populations exactly, English as a second language and students with special needs, as included in this commitment to all students having access to real world learning experiences, but appropriately, so that they can be successful. And we see our districts and particularly those who've been doing this a little longer, finding some really great ways to engage with employers in different parts of their work, finding ways to look at what they're trying to accomplish in their systems, which are in effect small cities, and think about how can we use that work as a context for students to learn. So I do not believe they should be excluded in any way. I think we have to shift our mental model to incorporate these essential skills and real learning pieces as part of what our job of helping students become empowered learners looks like. And then it's just a personalized, which is difficult, but a more personalized learning experience.
Thank you. Eric Eckholt asked a question, Laura, for you, but I think Austin and Jonathan, you may also have insights. And the implementation of programs that engage school district partners and confront issues of, seat time, teacher labor rules, those pieces of how you integrate into curriculum or work side by side. Any keys to success in bringing traditional education into partnership with those? And Laura, question directed for you if you have some thoughts.
I think those are all, this is very complex. I will say that too. There are many stakeholders in this work. We began with a humble goal of creating a learning community around this aspirational goal, and really thinking about how do we pace ourselves, which was, I'll just say it was very hard for me at first. Coming from the world I did, to recognize that this part was going to continue for a while, and it still continues. So what the magic around that has been is the 24 districts or so who are formally committed to this work, and those school leaders and their boards, which was part of our requirement to opt in, is that this really needed to be a strategic level commitment. They have met and continue to meet, and now they are meeting and talking about how do we, what are effective testing strategies going to look like? Who's got kids out of school, who's got kids in, so the learning community that we cultivated and that is now thriving is tackling other issues that are very essential to the healthy functioning of our systems. So there is value, even though that's a very difficult thing to put on a grant as an output. You know, what do the outputs for that? And you have to have a longer time frame, I would say.
Yeah. Thank you. Jonathan or Austin, anything you'd add in particular?
I was just going to I think talk a little bit about the systems concept, right, of systems integration and change around this. And we had a formal partnership with about 10 higher ed institutions. So I know the question was geared towards school districts, but systems are systems. And you know, some of the learnings that we had were where I saw the biggest success of where institutions really implemented quick reforms and saw almost immediate outcomes was really at the top. And if there is not the college president or the superintendent who is hammering this home as the singular goal, do you ask us that question, Dave? What is that outcome that keeps us up at night? Singular, there's a lot, but what's the one? The college presidents and superintendents who said, respectively, we have to get our college graduation rates up for low-income students, or the superintendent who said, we have to increase our college going rates, hell or high water. And they pivoted the entire institution around that singular outcome. Every other excuse fell by the wayside. Of course, they had state compliance to deal with. Of course, they had fundraising issues and shortfalls. They had enrollment drops. Texarkana College, one of our old funder friends is on this call right now, the Texas Pioneer Foundation, worked with us to partner with College Forward, Texarkana College, and Philanthropy. And that institution, which was one of the lowest performing two-year colleges in Texas, had the highest jumps in year-to-year persistence and graduation of any institution in a matter of 3 years. And it was because of those dynamics. So it is possible, but you have to have this top-down leadership. Without that, I think the whole thing falls by the wayside.
Thank you. I think, Jonathan, you indicated you're okay. It was I have one last quick question for each of you. We've said complex and we've said daunting, but what is the bright spot? If you were to hold up, here is the hope and here's the power and here is the opportunity to those who are considering how to commit to and support these endeavors. I'd like to get your thoughts, and maybe Austin, if we start with you, and then Laura, and then Jonathan, if you'll finish us up, that would be great.
It's so hard to answer this without giving an anecdote of a story that just happened last weekend. I feel like it is important that when we talk about students, we often talk about them as abstractions, people who are removed or just kind of clunking through these clunky systems. And for me, whenever I need hope and inspiration, I go zoom back in on these incredible human beings. We use deficit language way too often in our industry. The reality is that our students are the grittiest, most persistent, most resilient human beings, and they are the ones who are going to change this. Our first generation students who are walking the finish line and now serving finishing their PhDs, going on to become superintendents, those are the real change agents. Not a white kid from a middle-class family in South Texas is going to fix this. I think the more of where there's real hope is that the double-edged sword of the positive side of both the coins on these things is that it's not only the right thing to do to start solving the inequities in our higher education system, but once we do, or in so doing, we're building and scaffolding progress on itself. Because I'm a true believer that our students are the only population that are scaling quickly enough to solve this problem. And with more investment, with more ladders, more rungs, less rickety rungs on that ladder, that's our job. The people who are in influence, positions of influence and policy decision, we have to simplify this process for them so that they can go do exactly what I just said. They can go become the leaders and leading the reforms that we know they experienced on the negative side that they can maybe change for a future generation. And I just saw a student do that he was an immigrant student from Mexico. Every card stacked against him. He was at a 2-year college. He dropped out for 4 years, returned, just graduated from the University of Texas at Austin, is going to get his PhD in mathematics. And that guy's going to be a superintendent. It's his dream job. And that just happened last weekend. And if we can create more stories like that, I do think that these systems are going to start solving themselves because of them.
Thank you, Austin. Laura?
Yeah, I mean, I 100% agree that when you see a transformed student, that's a very bright spot. But I would also say, because I know that Jonathan has stories like that, when you work with the willing and you enter into the work with an attitude of humility, that this is not a prescription we're imposing. This is an opportunity we are missing in terms of unlocking potential. You will unlock potential in those adults as well. And not every adult is willing or able. They aren't all there at the starting point. But what we've observed is when you get enough, and it might be one lone nut to start, and then you create that small community that grows, lots of people who have a misgiving do come on board. And that coupled with the energy of those students. And I would also say the other, I think, tip is that you often end up working with leaders of organizations on the employer side. Those individuals who have just been in the workforce a few years are where the greatest source of your energy and connection can be. And so how do we tap into that has been something that we've also thought a lot about and have gotten great insight from the work that we've done with those young professionals in taking what they've learned and connecting them and flipping that right back into the system to help it adapt.
Thank you, Laura. Jonathan?
So when I'm thinking about my answer to this question, there's a question that comes to mind in response, which is, what is one thing that we could do to have the biggest impact on this issue long term? We and our team happen to believe it's getting young people living wage jobs sooner so they can build wealth sooner in their lives. And there's a story that comes to mind that makes me think about the opportunity and the promise ahead. And the story is, when I got started with Rooted about 6 years ago, we did a pilot of 15 students who were a mix of juniors and seniors at a local high school. At the end of that pilot, we worked with a local employer to provide internships. At the end of that internship, the employer warned me that he wasn't impressed with the students and didn't think it was going to be possible to get young people ready in time for a company like theirs. 4 to 5 years later, that employer is one of the early adopters who's going to be hiring 1 to 2 of our seniors right out of high school. And so the question comes, like, what happened in that 4 to 5 years to change a mind so quickly? And for me, that is the opportunity. It's the opportunity to prove a new possible if we start creating these relationships earlier in a student and an employer's journey with these students we're talking about.
Jonathan, thank you. One of the things we can't do in this format is hear and feel the applause and the appreciation and the smiles in the audience and the warmth that I think so many would extend to each of you. But thank you for the work that you do and for sharing your time and your insights with us collectively. And just tremendously appreciate you and the Philanthropy Roundtable for bringing us together this afternoon. Thank you, everyone.